We're going to start our final session this morning. As you heard earlier, this stuff matters, and one of the key issues with regard to the productivity or the output of the biomedical research enterprise, the research and development enterprise, is how well we're able to measure progress. We are going to come back to some of the issues raised by our first panel, and they raised a lot about some of the current benefits as well as some of the current challenges facing the biomedical enterprise and biomedical ecosystem now. So we are going to revisit some of those proposals, but as I talked about earlier, one of the key questions, and one of the questions that we focus on a lot here at Brookings is how do we know if we're making progress on these very important and challenging issues? So our final session today is going to revisit some of those same policy issues that we talked about before, but now from the standpoint of focusing on the metrics, the data sources that could be used to assess how we're doing and how we could be doing better. We've got a great panel of experts to help us with this. Our panelists include Mark Dean, the managing partner from the Foundry. And again, once again, you can read about all four of our panelists in more detail in the biographic information in your packets. Mark is unable to join us in person today due to some last-minute issues, but he will be joining us by phone, so you'll hear some opening comments from him. Then I'm going to turn to Jonathan Leff, on my left, managing partner at Warburg Pincus, who's been long involved in the innovation side and also in some of the recent legislation related to biomedical innovation. Then Henry Grabowski, Professor Emeritus in Economics and the Director of the Program in Pharmaceuticals and Health Economics at Duke University, who has long written and put together some of these metrics and tracked some of these metrics over time. And Murray Aitken, who has done so as well, most recently as Executive Director of the IMS Institute for Healthcare Informatics. So a tremendous amount of experience with not only thinking about these issues, but actually measuring how we're doing on this panel. So we're going to start off once again with some opening comments. Then we are going to have some more time for discussion after those comments. And I'd like to start with Mark Dean. Mark, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We're going to try to turn up the volume, but in the meantime, you could speak directly into that receiver. That would be great.
You bet. Okay. Do we have, I don't know if the slides are showing up there.
They're up, and we're going to advance them for you.
Great, okay. So we can just go ahead and flip over to slide 2. I'm going to try to hit some of the things that are top issues for the world that I live in, which is the extremely early stage new company creation end of this ecosystem. And you know, one of the ways that I frame our presence in the ecosystem is that there are the big fish out there, the Amgens and Medtronics and J&Js of the world. There are the little fish out there that are the, you know, companies that are out, you know, in and through their clinical trials trying to get their therapies out deployed to the patients. And if that's how you frame those two, then we're basically plankton. And, you know, the reason I find that useful is that, you know, plankton may be small and they're hard to see, but if you don't pay attention to them and keeping them alive, at the end of the day, the big fish aren't going to be all that happy either. So I'm going to try to hit a few things at a very top level and try to just talk about some things that I think we can specifically measure and track. And I'm going to show a couple of graphs of each of these. And, you know, I want to say up front that the graphs that I'm going to show may not be the right graphs. They may not be from the right sources. But I think it represents the type of data that will be useful in tracking the long-term health of my end of the ecosystem, I think. So I also just did want to take a moment to thank the other speakers and to thank everybody there who put so many long hours in on the recently passed and hopefully soon to be signed bill. I think that the metrics that we are talking about today, there are a large number of new metrics that are in those that legislation that are going to even better help track the health here, and hopefully we'll be able to show those metrics going in the right direction. So I'm going to touch briefly on the financing environment, FDA patents, and then want to take a stab at discussing burn rate, and that gets to really what I'm saying there is the efficiency with which companies do their clinical trials, and that can be that can have a major impact on the success or failure of a company and of a therapy. So we can go ahead and switch to the next slide. And so there's any number of metrics that are out there today, and I'm hoping I'm not going to overlap much with Jonathan here. These metrics are talking about what is the health of the medical device and healthcare investing world. And one that's been shown a lot in kind of various forms is the graph on the lower right, which is basically new issuances of medical device startup companies by year. And you can see that even prior to the economic meltdown, the trend was not good. So I won't spend too much time on what those actual numbers are. What I think is important to track, in addition to specifically the numbers, is how venture capitalists feel about investing in this space. And the other graphic, maybe a little bit hard to read, but what the upper left graphic is from a VC survey done by Startup in Vivo magazine, asking how do investors feel about the venture world. And they broke it down by biopharma specialists, device specialists, and life science generalists. So these are all people who are actually putting money in the industry. And there's a large number of neutral to negative in the different sectors here. And I think that this is an important type of metric to be looking at long term, because early stage investing does have a heavy emotional as well as an analytical content to it. And if people are just general negative trends, then that doesn't bear well for us. The other thing that I think is interesting is that all of these tables are always venture capital surveys and venture capital investments. But I think that what we're seeing out there, and Jonathan could probably speak to this much better than I, is a real erosion in the investment by and confidence of the limited investors, the large institutions that actually put the money into the venture capitalists in the first place. And that money is drying up pretty dramatically. And that is being tracked, but you don't see it talked about, and you don't see it put up in visuals nearly as often as the strict venture capital deals. And I think in the long term, we're going to need to be able to track the inflow money and the attitudes about the people that control the inflow money from the limited partners as well. I can flip to slide 4. And this is just a different way of looking at, where people expect to be investing. Again, I think this is representative more of the type of metrics rather than maybe specifically these metrics. These are from the National Venture Capital Association. The upper left one is showing a response on where people expect to be investing within the healthcare sector. And, there's a significant downturn in 3-year looking forward expectations of investment in biopharma and med devices and uptick in services and IT. Hopefully if we're doing our job and addressing some of the challenges that we have before us, we'll start to see these numbers flatten out over time. But I think this is the sort of metric that will start to help us watch those trend lines. And, Mr. Scherer talked about his confidence in the U.S. development ecosystem for pharma. I wish I could share all of his optimism there, but, on the medical device side of things, there really is a ground shift right now in people moving not just to clinical trials, but to entire companies overseas. And the bottom right metric shows an expectation that shift will continue. And again, this is venture capitalists saying, what do you expect to see in the next 3 years? And I can tell you I voted to approve a term sheet to move a company to Singapore last week. I see one from Russia right now, and I have friends that are in Europe setting up the companies, as I speak here. So we actually are seeing a very different experience. Now, do I think that that's going to continue long term and be successful? I absolutely do agree that there is no better place to do this type of innovation than here in the U.S. And I hope to see these trend lines reverse. But again, I think if we're talking metrics, it's an important thing to pay attention to. Okay, so slide 5. There's been much talk about the changes in approval levels and rates of IDEs and PMAs. These are just a couple of slides that have been presented over the years. They're a bit out of date again, so PMAs have ticked up again a little bit. We hope to see that trend continue. I do think that the main thing I want to convey here is these are critical parameters to measure, and we need to measure them rapidly and repeatedly. I think we were talking about quarterly reports in the new legislation. I think that's a great idea. I think that there are additional metrics that are in the new legislation that will help to really tell us where things are going, whether pendency times are going down because of withdrawals or because of approvals or because systems are really improving. So I think some of the key metrics are obvious and have been discussed a lot. IDEs submitted and approved, number of cycle times for IDEs, PMA cycle times and approvals. This is kind of above my academic pay grade, but it would be interesting to try to come up with a quality measure that looked at how efficiently we're getting some of these projects or projects in general through this pipeline. Kind of a ratio of IDEs in to PMAs out to products commercialized. Not sure, off the top of my head. I've thought about it a little bit. I'm not exactly sure how to do that, but I think that might be an interesting metric to try to develop separately. Slide 6. I talk briefly about the patent office. Heard a little bit earlier in the last session about patents being an important part of this ecosystem as well. It's very, very true. The medical device world lives and dies by their patents for sure. I would like to commend Director Kaplis for the work that he's done over the last few years. We really have seen a dramatic change in both pendency times and number of patents that have issued, but they also have some interesting quality measures that kind of go above where the depth that I wanted to get into here, that show that not only are the numbers going in the right way, but they're not doing it just at the cost of quality. That the actual quality measures that they use to calculate how good the patents that are issuing are actually up as well. So I think this is a great success story. And I think that, it's a success story also in the face of what could have been some really damaging legislation that thankfully was not put into place a couple of years ago when we were looking at the patent reform bill. I think keeping the patent system friendly not just to large tech companies but also to small healthcare companies is going to be critical going forward. And being able to track that health and show it is going to be important for this sort of metric exercise. Slide 7. This was just a model that I put together very simplistically to try to illustrate something that I think our companies try to model and track these items pretty closely within our startups, but in conversations with others and in preparation for the panel, it didn't seem like that was universal. So I thought it would be good to get out in this forum and talk about and eventually incorporate into whatever metrics we try to put together going forward. And it's really clinical trial efficiency. And the table up in the upper left corner just kind of shows two theoretical companies in an early stage, maybe feasibility or a phase 2 device type of trial. They scale up their number of sites. Maybe they get to 10 sites. Company number 1 chugs along, enrolling a patient a week, and their burn rates are the same, $650K a month. But because of that slow enrollment rate, which you see as the blue line scaling up in the chart in the lower right, they spend over $12 million to get to their enrollment target. Company B concentrates not on more sites, but on more efficiency, getting twice as many patients per month through their cycle. Really doesn't cost them all that much more per month, but because they enroll so much quicker, where the red line plateaus is actually the end of the trial, and I believe in the model it was 5 months earlier, they spend less than $8 million. So if the company went out and financed to a plan around what Company B executed, but they actually execute to Plan A, there was obviously a significant shortfall on the financing side of things. They're going to be forced to go out and try to raise money with really no milestones. They're halfway through their trial. They don't have any visibility to their data, and it's a real dead pool place for a company to be. And so individual companies need to be tracking this, and this may be a way for us to track what which companies are being successful, which companies aren't, by how well they perform to this sort of a metric. And I think that was it for kind of opening comments on just some thoughts on what things might be important to track. And I thought I'd try to keep it brief so we could have a longer discussion.
Great, Mark. Thanks very much for joining us and presenting these measures and your thoughts about them. Now I'd like to turn to Jonathan, who has some metrics to present of his own, and you're going to do it yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And see if we can get this working. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today, and thank you for holding this conference to ask what I think is the central question, which is what is the state of the biomedical enterprise? If you don't know you have a problem, then you can't fix it. So it's absolutely essential to ask that question. I think that the enterprise is in a state of crisis, and that's a strong word, but I think it's the right word. And the basic reason why it is on this first slide. And this is the chart that Dr. Collins referred to in his comments earlier this morning. It's drawn from a paper published a few months ago in Nature Reviews. This looks at a simple measure of R&D productivity. It's the number of new drugs approved by the FDA per $1 billion of R&D spending. And it looks at this measure over a 60-year period. When you look at it, you can clearly see the relentless decline at a more or less constant rate on this log scale over 6 decades. And in fact, this measure of R&D productivity for the overall enterprise has consistently dropped by 50% roughly every 9 years for the last 60 years. And that led the authors, as Dr. Collins pointed out, to coin this term Eroom's law, which is Moore's law spelled backwards. And this leads, and this is staggering to me, but this has led to an 80 times decrease in productivity. So the industry is 1/80th as productive today as it was at the beginning of this time period 60 years ago, which is the compounding effect of this halving every 9 years. And I've tried hard to think of another industry that has experienced anything like this in history and lived to tell about it. And frankly, I can't think of one. I'm not sure there is one. And this phenomenon really is at the heart of the crisis in our innovation enterprise. We must change the trajectory of this curve if we want to continue to bring new treatments to patients. Now, mathematically, there are 3 factors that drive this measure, R&D productivity: time, cost, and probability of success. And as I think everyone in this room knows, probability of success in drug development is abysmal, and it has been abysmal for quite some time. But what has changed over the decades and is driving this decline has primarily been the time and cost of drug development, which have increased systematically. So on this next slide, I present a few illustrations of the time and cost issues, a few metrics to look at. On the left, you can see that the estimated all-in cost of drug development has been increasing rapidly over time. These, of course, aren't perfect measures, but clearly the trend is apparent, and it's now estimated to cost over $2 billion all in to bring a single drug to market. The middle panel here is an analysis that I did of the actual total investor capital that was required by a number of recent venture-backed companies that got their first drug to market. And so you can look how much capital these companies had to raise and spend in the process of getting to their first successful drug. the actual average amount for these companies was $1.5 billion. That's money raised from investors to get to that first drug. And of course, these are the success stories. For each one of these companies, there are dozens more that never made it or are still struggling to get there. And then finally, on the right, if you look at the actual development time for the 14 fast-track drugs approved by the FDA in 2011, and by the way, this was the best year in quite some time in terms of total drugs and also fast-track drugs. If you look at those 14 fast-track drugs, the average years in development was 11 years for those drugs. And being fast-track drugs for specialty diseases, these generally move through development faster than the broader universe of standard drugs. So the inevitable result of this cost and time issue is that the return on investment in biopharma R&D has declined sharply. And on the left here, you can see that McKinsey estimates that big pharma's return on its R&D investment has declined from the mid-teens in the early 90s to less than 5% in the second half of the last decade. Now, you may ask, as a matter of public policy, why should we care how much money big pharma is making from its R&D investments? And the answer, of course, is we shouldn't, except that big pharma today is not making an acceptable return on its R&D investments. And if that remains true, pharma companies will inevitably slash those investments. And that's really the point made by these quotes on the right. I won't go through them all, but these are quotes from a number of industry analysts and senior executives in the pharma industry that basically make that point. Morgan Stanley said it very bluntly in the title of a report here, Pharmaceuticals Exit Research and Create Value. Now, some people will say, all right, that's okay. And this point was made to some extent on the first panel that big pharma can and has been reducing its R&D, and particularly its early stage R&D, and has been becoming the commercialization engine for the therapeutic innovations developed by small biotech companies. So you could say that that's okay. And in fact, that's already been true for quite some time. Venture-backed small companies have been key to the development of most of our important new drugs. And this slide just makes that point. Of those 14 fast-track drugs that I mentioned for serious unmet needs that were approved by FDA last year, 12 of them had roots in venture capital-backed small companies. But the problem is that these small emerging companies need to get their money from somewhere, and that somewhere is venture capital. But the life sciences venture capital world is suffocating under the weight of the same R&D productivity problem that's crippling the whole R&D innovation enterprise. And this slide really is designed to make that point. This is all the data that I could pull together from publicly available sources that shows the returns to investors from investing in life sciences-focused venture capital funds over the decade of the 2000s. And it turns out that the pension funds, the university endowments, and the others who provide the money for venture funds to invest have essentially earned nothing from investing in life sciences innovation over the last decade. For every dollar they've invested, they've essentially gotten back roughly $1 many years later. And this situation brings to mind Herbert Steins Law. Herbert Stein was an economist who famously said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. And now it's essential to keep in mind that these pension funds and these endowments who provide money for this activity do it for one reason, and it's not to find cures for disease. That's not their job. Their job is to earn a return on their investment. And most people will tell you that the target rate of return for these investors in venture capital is between 20 and 30%. Obviously, the field has been nowhere near that. The inevitable result is that these investors are taking their money elsewhere, to technology companies, energy companies, China, India, wherever, but they're not reinvesting it into medical innovation. So this is showing up in a number of ways. This slide makes the point that venture firms are pulling out of life sciences or shutting down altogether, and limited partners, the providers of capital for this activity, are questioning the merits of the entire activity altogether. But this next slide, I think, is a metric that may be the most important or immediate measure of the issue in venture capital, which is the number of new companies receiving first-time life sciences venture capital funding. And this is, in effect, the top of the innovation funnel in terms of the translation of academic research into commercial R&D, and is really an early indicator of the flow of future venture-backed medical products to the market. There's been an alarming decline over the last several years. 2011 saw the lowest number of new life sciences companies funded in 15 years, and this trend continued into 2012, where the first quarter was the lowest quarterly level of new companies funded since 1995. And venture capitalists expect the situation to get worse, not better. This is from a survey referenced in the last presentation that was done late last year, which showed that venture investors who by nature are optimists expect to continue to reduce their allocation of investment to life sciences over the next 3 years. And then finally, I want to close with one measure of how the declining investment capital appears to be beginning to translate into reduced drug development activity. And these statistics on this last slide are very rough, but it does appear that the number of new clinical trial starts at each stage is beginning to drop substantially and has been beginning to drop over the last several years. And of course, this reminds us why all of this matters. And it's not because anybody here should be worried about the welfare of venture capitalists, or certainly about big pharma. It's because we all should be worried about what this means for the health of the innovation enterprise. Ultimately, if investors can't earn returns from investing in medical innovation, then they will put their money into something else instead. That is an inevitable fact in a free market economy. And without that investment capital, many medical breakthroughs, as Dr. Collins talked about, we're in a really exciting time for medical breakthroughs in the lab, but many of those breakthroughs simply will not make the trip from the lab to patients because the investment capital won't be there unless we address this problem. So when we think about how to measure the impact of policy alternatives to try and address this problem, we need to think about how we restore the return on investment in this sector. And one place to look certainly is the time and cost of developing drugs, which is what's been dragging down the productivity of these investments over the past several decades.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. So I'd like to turn now to Professor Grabowski. And do you want to do your own slides as well?
Just
that's the forward button.
Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. And after hearing these speakers, maybe Murray and I can at least have some slivers of optimism in our talk. So I'm going to talk about basically from the perspective of the R&D cost studies that I've been part of with the Tufts group and Joe DeMasi and his group. There's been 3 of them so far. Well, actually 3 plus 1 focused on the biotech, biopharmaceutical area. And they focus on the decades of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We've been doing these about every 10 years. And we have one in progress right now focused on the 2000 period, and that should be done by the end of the year. And we know about some of the components and how they're trending. So just going to briefly, what lessons can we pull out of those studies about where the critical factors are, and then what are some of the current trends, both on the cost side as well as on metrics for measuring quality. So here's a capsule of the 3 studies that we've done. The 70s approvals, the 80s approvals, and the 90 approvals. The far right shows that in $2,000 dollars measured, adjusting for inflation, the R&D cost for 70s approvals was a little over 100 million, then it jumped to 300 million, and then to 800 million. And these are fully allocated capital costs. They take account of failures. They capitalize to the data marketing based on a cost of capital to account for the long time periods. And just to note that between the 70s and the 80s, it was the preclinical stage that had more growth. in cost, but then from the 80s to the 90s, it was really that second bar, the clinical, jumped from 104 million to 466 million. So over and above inflation, costs have been growing at 7%, which accounts for why these costs are more than doubling every decade. So you could sort of, from a very broad perspective, why is it so long and costly? And of course, the first factor is that this is decision-making under uncertainty. There are all these scientific, regulatory, and commercial uncertainties. They're particularly big at the preclinical level, but even as you go through the clinic, through each phase, if something's successful in phase 1, that allows you to make a bet on phase 2, which is a bigger bet in terms of money and a longer time and so forth. And the management of the R&D process is highly variable. I think there can be improvements there. Ultimately, you're talking about a very labor-intensive process where it builds up to thousands of subjects being tested in hospitals and clinics. It's a very labor-intensive process with physicians, investigators, data collectors, and it's in the medical sector, which has costs have increased much faster than general inflation. And the biggest factor, which various people have alluded to, that I think explains why costs are so much, is that most new drug candidates fail to reach the market. So here's from our last study, one way of looking at the phase probabilities is say, how many drugs do you need to take into the clinic to get one approval? And going into the first phase, which is in subjects, non-patients generally, but volunteers to find out about dosage and toxicity, you need to take 5 projects, the success rates around 20% at the phase 1 level to get to an approval. And then phase 2, you need to have 3.3 products to get to an eventual approval. The success is improving, but you still need to have 3. And then in the phase 3, you need 1.5 to get to eventual approval. And of course, the costs go the other way. As you get to each phase, the number of subjects or patients grows and the time grows, so that if you fail, you want to try to fail as fast as possible, a point that was made earlier, that to the extent that you fail in phase 3, you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars. So one way to improve the process is to try to weed out the failures earlier in the process. In terms of what goes into the final number, the probability of success is a key factor. If you could increase, for instance, from 1 in 5 projects that you have to take candidates to get a success to 1 in 3, you would lower, and everything else remained constant, you would lower R&D costs by 30%. So there's a big margin there if we can improve the probability of success. And there's some good news in the sense that biologics, in our study of biologic products, they have a significantly higher probability of success than small molecule drugs. They have like a 33% success rate compared to small molecules, which seem to have a significantly lower success rate now. It's 1 in 6. And so we didn't find, though, that factor was offset by higher preclinical costs and other costs. So costs still got to be, more than $800 million for a biotech drug. But because the knowledge is better there, the probability of success is higher. The number of subjects, where it's not clear, that's another huge driver, obviously, as well as clinical trial complexity and input prices. Complexity, we have metrics that the number of tests being done on patients and the frequency, those are increasing. So tests are becoming more complex. Input prices are growing much faster than inflation. The number of subjects we don't have a handle on yet. Clinical trial length is pretty stable. It's shorter at the approval stage, but a little longer in the whole clinical trial phase. And for big pharma, the cost of capital is much smaller now because you can borrow cheaper, the return on equity is lower. But as Jonathan mentioned, for smaller firms, it's the availability of financing. So that could be a limiting factor. So I wanted to mention some about quality output measures. And I think if you get away from just the quantity, that E-room curve that goes straight down, and look at quality metrics, I think if you went back pre-62 or pre-Kefauver amendments, we had all sorts of, 50 to 60 drugs a year, but we didn't have the quality that I think we have now. And there are different measures here, priority versus standard FDA approvals. The Tufts Center that's looked at markers here for priority drugs, they found that while the number of new drugs have been going down steadily over the last 20 years, the percentage that are rated as priority, one measure of quality, is at an all-time high. It's around 50% in their most recent 5-year period that they looked at. Of course, the most important measures of quality are eventually, for patients, it's quality of life, it's quantity of life, but those take a long time to observe. And I think these are markers that we can look at to gauge quality. Another is first-in-class or new mechanism of action. I've studied that in looking at global new drugs over a period of time, and there are more first-in-class drugs as a percentage of the total. Within a class, it's not always just the first-in-class. There's often, drugs become best-in-class that aren't the first-in-class, significant advances. Maybe a third of the drugs that are in an existing class are rated as priority by the FDA, meaning they think it's improving the patient outputs in that class. Consensus term that's been used by economists are global NMEs. If we can track how fast drugs diffuse all over the world, particularly in developed markets, that is a marker that tells us if everybody's adopting it quickly, it's probably very good in terms of patients, and it's also good for the company's return on investment. And then we can weight FDA approvals by sales, by patent citations, by medical articles, in other words. So I think while I agree totally there is a significant productivity problem, it's offset somewhat by we have higher quality drugs for the fewer drugs we have. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much for those comments, and a note of optimism with some of the metrics that you presented. We're going to come back to discussing all of these, but first I'd like to turn to Marie Aiken.
Thanks, Mark, and let me start off by saying I applaud the effort to bring this conference together, and I think all of the speakers this morning have, in a sense, intentionally or otherwise, reinforced the need for a set of compelling and comprehensive metrics about the state of the biomedical innovation system, because in a sense we really don't know. We really don't know what's going on. I think we see measures here and there, and we can see dramatic charts of one form or another, yet there is no sort of holistic or comprehensive way that we can collectively agree on, in fact, what's happening. And certainly from our perspective at IMS, we're in the business of measuring things. We like to measure things. We understand the complexity of measuring things. And we would be the first to admit that there are no good measures out there on the state of biomedical innovation. So we are hopeful that coming out of this event, we can actually make some very concrete steps towards doing that. So rather than showing my own version of views of what's going on, I'm only going to show one chart and a little bit speak to that. And again, this is one imperfect view of what's been going on. This is our tracking of the number of new molecular entities that have been launched in the US. Launch is different than FDA approvals. Sometimes there's timing differences and so on. What we focus on is can the patient get the drug? And this is our 10-year view of that trend line. Now, we can all stare at this and draw our own conclusions about whether this is demonstrating the end of the innovation cycle or we're about to start a new upward tick in the cycle. And again, that speaks to the fact that we just don't know. At least we get beyond the simple total number of FDA approvals or launches, and here we're showing separately the number of new mechanisms that were approved each year in the lower part of the chart. We were in double digits from that perspective in the earlier part of the decade. Fell to 6 in 2007 and 2008, back up to 9 in 2011. We also then are differentiating those new mechanisms from new molecular entities, but which use existing mechanisms of action, which is at the top of the chart. And you can see, again, a trend line here that suggests overall these numbers have been increasing. And I think here we are limited, though, in saying whether existing mechanisms are necessarily breakthrough or not. And again, there's a lot of debate about the terminology that's used. But we've certainly seen those numbers go up. And then the group in the middle are those drugs that, when launched, have an orphan drug designation by the FDA. And you can see that that's actually been a fairly steady increase over the last 10 years. But I think, again, our point would be that the one chart that we'd like to see retired permanently, and I'd love it if we could leave this conference agreeing we're not going to show it again, is the one that does show the spending on R&D each year and the number of FDA approvals each year, because I just continue to think that that's such an imperfect measure of anything, in fact. A couple of things I want to just throw into the mix here. One is we've been talking about the US biomedical innovation system, and I think it's important to realize that there is no such thing as a closed innovation system. We heard some reference to that this morning, but perhaps not enough. For example, if you take the 34 new molecular entities that became available to US patients in 2011, 21 of those were patented. Their original patent was issued by a non-US company, which is a pretty good proxy for where the original discovery occurred. So 21 out of the 34, that original discovery occurred outside of the US. Of the 9 new mechanisms that became available to American patients in 2011, 5 of those were patented outside of the US. So I do think it's essential that we don't have this notion that we are operating in our own innovation system. We clearly are not, and that's a good thing, because while we may be the leader, though we have to define what that means, we don't have a monopoly on all the great scientists in the world, and there's a lot of investment and a lot of great work going on outside of the US. We should have a point of view about how much of that we want, what share of that we want to have, but certainly we shouldn't deny that it's happening. And indeed, the health of the US innovation system does depend on the ability of US-based companies to be able to access global innovation wherever it is occurring around the world. I think that also speaks to the importance of global alignment of regulatory approaches to evidence and decision-making. And I know that the FDA has certainly has that as a priority to bring greater harmonization. Second point I want to make is that, as I say, we do believe that a set of metrics is essential to really understand what's going on within clinical development. As Henry mentions, There's a lot of good ideas about things that we can and should be looking at on a systematic basis. We should differentiate what's coming through the pipeline in terms of whether it's a new mechanism, whether it's an existing mechanism with incremental improvement. We should be thinking about the innovation in terms of what impact it can have on disease treatment and on patients, the magnitude of the unmet need in terms of population and severity of disease. Doesn't show up in these kinds of charts, but we would argue it should. We should be certainly systematically measuring the success rate as innovation moves through the pipeline and through the various stages, the attrition rate. And again, this is not captured systematically and transparently right now. And the length of time that it takes for compounds to advance through approval. And then we also need metrics around the resources that are required to move those products through the pipeline. And I think here we hear a lot about the need for greater resources to be invested in order to advance a product through clinical development that have been imposed on the companies, the innovative companies by the regulator. And certainly that's a part of it. As the science evolves, the need for more evidence may indeed rise. I think there is another side to this, which is the efficiency with which the private sector companies who are advancing clinical development, the efficiency with which they actually go about undertaking those clinical trials. From our perspective, we still see a remarkably inefficient approach to protocol development, to site selection, to investigator recruitment, to patient selection. And as we already saw, these have very big impacts on the ultimate returns on investment. The good news is there is information out there. It just doesn't all come together in one place. We have one of several proprietary data sets that seeks to track the activity that's occurring in the global R&D sector. Again, there are several of these out there. The one that we have is tracking around 8,000 compounds right now. We have a team of 9 people who sit in London, and they spend all of their time mining publicly available information. They spend their time going out to conferences and populating a database that is accessible, albeit it's one in the private sector. So I think while there are limitations to the existing data sets, there is more than we typically see used and discussed in public forums. And I do think that it's time that we pull our efforts together and come up with a set of metrics that can be more compelling. So let me stop there and leave it to the discussion.
Murray, thanks for concluding with a challenge, which I'd like to use as a jumping off point for starting this discussion. You all collectively have laid out a number of measures related to how we're doing in the biomedical enterprise and the biomedical ecosystem. And those include measures related to investments, so public, NIH and the like, pharma, venture capital, LPs, and so forth, as Jonathan emphasized. Measures related to the initiation of research, IDEs filed, clinical trials getting underway, new companies being formed. Measures related to approvals of products, 501ks, PMAs, new molecular entities, new drugs, and the last part of the discussion, particular emphasis on the sort of the more innovative of those products as measured by things like priority NMEs or a fast track, or whether or not a treatment represents a significant advance or first in class, other types of metrics along those same lines. And going on with approvals, failures, particularly failures later in the development process. Some measures related to costs of development, as Mark emphasized, time and the burn rate, the cost per month of conducting research and development of a product, and then in turn a number of the elements contributing to that burn rate, the clinical trial size, the patient accrual rates, the cost of capital, the cost of other inputs involved, and so forth. Also noted that Henry noted that what really matters here is the ultimate results for patients, although those are hard to take some time to observe in terms of quantity and quality of life and other things that get at ultimate productivity. But many of you noted that there were some gaps, and I'd like to come back. Murray, you seem to be pushing for metrics that were more focused on kind of the qualitative value of not just the volume of drug approvals or the number of trials, but some measures perhaps related to the quality of the product or its impact on patient health, and then extending that into the research and development process itself, the quality of the trials. And you mentioned at the end that it seems like there's still a lot of inefficiencies. That was certainly a topic that came up in the first panel as well. So I'd like to start off this discussion with maybe a few pointed comments from each of you about where you think we could do better on metrics. And don't worry, we're going to come back to the issue of interpreting the metrics and tying them back to the policy reforms that were discussed in the first panel that many of you all touched upon as well. Where are the best opportunities for improving the kind of dashboard that could come together about tracking the ecosystem here? We'll start, Jonathan?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll just say this is an incredibly hard problem. And as I thought about trying to put together my comments here about metrics, it struck me just what a hard problem it is. And the reason it's such a hard problem is that I think we all agree about what we care about. What we care about is health outcomes for patients. I mean, we want to make a difference in survival or quality of life ultimately for patients who are affected by disease. But you can try and measure that, but the link between what we're doing to bring new drugs to market and new therapeutic interventions to market and those measures are completely confounded, and they're confounded by the impact of time, by decades through which the development of those interventions affect those data measures, and they're confounded by all kinds of other factors that may affect health outcomes. So that provides actually a very poor indicator, except maybe over the course of 50 years, it provides a very poor indicator of what we're trying to measure. So you have to go back from there and look for less perfect measures that provide some sort of a earlier but more useful dashboard as to the things that you care about. And that drives us to then start talking about things like, okay, well, how many drugs are getting approved, and can we measure, are they good drugs or quality drugs, and how many drugs are in each stage of development, and how much investment is coming into the system. But I think what all this cries out for is some kind of conceptual model of what is ultimately driving the thing that we care about in terms of how the innovation enterprise affects health outcomes. And that's why I've sort of drilled down to focusing on the formation of investment capital, because you've got this may be a dangerous analogy to use because it's so politically controversial, but I'll throw it out there anyway. If you want to talk about global climate change, it's not very useful to measure the temperature tomorrow to sort of assess how you're doing against that. You've got to have some kind of conceptual model with regard to what affects the thing that you care about, which is global climate change. And so if you believe in a conceptual model whereby carbon output into the atmosphere ultimately drives the thing that you care about, then you try to look at interventions that are going to affect the carbon output. Well, here, I think if you believe in a model that I tried to present, which is that ultimately we have a free market system that if we set it up correctly will drive therapeutic interventions to patients as long as there are economic incentives that attract capital into the system, and as long as we set up a system that rewards innovators for bringing interventions that really make a difference to patients. And we need to look at every step in the system and make sure that we're rewarding real innovation and not just new products, but products that actually make a difference for patients. If we do that, and then we look at the measures of investment and return on investment and set up a system whereby investors are attracted to invest in this enterprise, then we will ultimately we should feel confident that ultimately that will translate into a benefit for patients. But if we have a system, and my grave concern is what we have today, is a system that is a fantastic system for translating the science into new medicines, except that it costs so much and takes so long and the probability of success is so horrendous that people don't make a return from doing it, so they're taking their money to invest in new iPads and widgets and social networks and other things. So we're going to have a lot of those things and a lot less of the new medicines unless we change those underlying drivers of the system.
Henry?
Yeah, so I was struck in the earlier panel about the sharing of information, and this information is really in silos. Early on, the information is in academic centers and smaller firms, and then larger firms know a lot about development, and then we have a few places where health records and none of them are being really shared or very transparent. And I think there's some beginning initiatives, like there's a site I've tried to work with called clinicaltrials.gov, which is the government's attempt to sort of put information not only on successful drugs, but at failures. So if you get more information about failures and what happened, and it's still rudimentary, but I think more efforts like that and to bring together information, why is it that only 1 in 6 drugs get approved? And there must be a lot of duplicative effort where people are going down the same track. And if we had better information, just my limited experience in even dealing at a company level as a director, it was hard to even share information with other companies whose products could be combined into one pill. Sort of combination therapies in AIDS or in cancer are a big growth area. Often you need more than one pill if you can put it together. But companies even have trouble sharing information where it's important to do so. So I think there's something we could do on those measures.
I think there are measures that are available that again just don't sort of come together. For example, we looked at those 34 new products launched last year. How many patients can be affected by those? And that's a metric that we looked at, and we came up with an answer of 20 million patients. We think that's actually a more useful measure perhaps than simply there's 34 molecules. In terms of the real value of the drug, yes, you can wait 20 years to measure that perfectly, but I think we do have a system where drugs get reimbursed, and there are payers who are willing to make their judgments about value of medicines or devices. And that may be an adequate proxy in terms of the ultimate sort of healthcare value that may be delivered by the drug. But again, we tend not to look at that systematically and use that as a basis for saying whether or not our innovation system is getting stronger or not. But I think we could if we put our minds to it.
Yeah, it's I'm kind of struck with the comments that all of you in a way made, which is that, gosh, we've got a fantastic system, except that it's really expensive and costs way too much, and it's way too inefficient. And we've seen those same comments made about the healthcare delivery system as a whole, where there is a lot of reform going on that is also tied to trying to come up with better metrics of whether we're doing a better job of accomplishing what we want. And it's very hard there as well, since the same kind of things that we really care about, outcomes for patients, overall costs, are hard to measure. They take a long time. They're determined by many other things besides specific activities of individual physicians, or in this case, individual companies or product developers. And what's happened there is a reliance not just on trying to refine the outcome measures, ways of maybe capturing it sooner. I was struck with kind of a analogy, as you said, Jonathan, that if investment capital up front is a measure of just how much confidence the market has in the opportunities for returns or added value in this industry, coupled with something about whether the companies are getting rewarded for what really matters, and that gets to your point, Murray, about market-driven metrics. So maybe linking the products approved to some measure of how much payers are willing to pay for them, as opposed to just the number of products that make it. Maybe there's some ways of getting some more comprehensive metrics together there that's actually not that far divorced from some of the activities that are happening on the healthcare reform measure side, but was also struck by some of the comments about where the other place that people go when it's hard to measure the ultimate outcomes is to try to capture important aspects of the process better, or structure better. So are there metrics that could be related to pre-competitive information sharing, or to more efficient trial design, or to better use of markers for toxicity or clinical benefit that would take less time and cost to observe, and can we track how we're doing with progress in those areas? And that is not meant just to be a summary, but to kind of lead to my next question, which is sort of tying back to some of the policy opportunities that we talked about earlier. Any comments that you all would like to make about what you've heard from the other panelists, about what you've heard this morning on where this measurement enterprise can really focus to help support the kinds of reforms in the biomedical ecosystem that could help improve innovation and improve the availability of valuable treatments to patients?
Well, I would say, again, if you believe in this conceptual model that what's dragging down the enterprise is that the cost, time, and probability of success are daunting, then let's set an ambitious goal for ourselves. Let's say, we've seen how the cost and time have gone up and up over the decades, and the probability of success, despite all of our efforts and new tools, has not improved. Let's set a goal for ourselves and say, over some period of time, let's cut the time and cost in half of developing new drugs, and let's double the probability of success. Which that sounds outrageous, but we're talking about going from 9% to 18% or something, which shouldn't be such a crazy thing to try and do. But if we could do those things, and we're not going to be able to measure them perfectly, but we can measure the directionality of moving those parameters. If we can do those things, we'll be sitting here in 15 or 20 years looking at an explosion of investment in innovative new therapies, and talking about all of the excitement about not just the promise of what's being discovered in the lab, but the excitement about how that's being taken through clinical development and translated into new therapies for patients. So let's set tangible goals for ourselves, and then let's figure out how we're going to do it. Now, these are not going to be easy things to do. I mean, when you look at that curve of the productivity going down for 60 years, Dr. Collins said, it looks like a law. I don't think it's a law of nature, and I know he didn't mean that. He was being tongue-in-cheek. But it certainly, when you see something that is linear in its rate of change for 6 decades, that means there are a lot of factors, not just one, but a lot of factors underlying it, and they're factors that are relatively intractable to efforts to change them. So we're going to have to do not just one thing, but a whole lot of things. There are going to have to be a lot of ideas that we bring to the table, and a lot of things that may be uncomfortable for some of us to contemplate in terms of changing the way that we operate many of our institutions and many of our business models. But if we want to cut the time and cost in half and double the probability of success, that's what we're going to have to do.
Not just metrics, but a bold goal. Other comments?
Yeah, this is Mark. I'm going to bring something up that my good friend Josh Mackauer brought up in a conference call in prep for this session, and that was, this is a complex multivariate systems analysis problem. And, we're a bunch of, entrepreneurs and venture capitalists and policy folks and, economists, all valuable, with valuable inputs. But, maybe you do something kind of different. You go get one of these high-end systems engineers to do a systems engineering analysis of what this thing looks like. Josh was using the nuclear power plant analogy. In a nuclear power plant, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, but eventually the engineers figure out that there's probably about a half a dozen big red buttons that really need to be watched closely. And if we're going to set an ambitious goal like, doubling our efficiency, we're going to have the right inputs. And I do think that the legislation that was just passed is really going to help us a lot to understand it in a much richer manner where some of our promising new technologies are falling out of the system. And that will help us a lot to populate a model like this. And then, it's only through building and populating the model and then trying to push on some of those variables that we're going to, in any systematic way, be able to take something and double it over a reasonable amount of time.
Any further comments?
Yeah, if we look forward, and maybe the future is more targeted medicines, right? So if you think about something like Herceptin, where it's, works for certain breast cancer patients, and for those patients, it's a breakthrough drug. And that suggests that, if we're able to identify those preclinically, we may not have to do, the trials may not be as big, the probability of success may be higher. At the same time, we need the diagnostics to sort of tell us that. And I think sort of coupling diagnostics with medicines, diagnostics, I think, have been under-incentivized, undervalued to some extent. But I think that's the wave of the future. And maybe that will help us on this productivity part of the equation. But we will have to have better diagnostics, and we're going to have to pay for those too.
Murray?
I like the idea of a sort of audacious goal. I think that's great. I think we should also remember not to let the perfect get in the way of the good. I think there are things we can be looking at more systematically now to help actually diagnose some of the drivers of the state of the biomedical innovation system. But I think, but we also have to build in sufficient flexibility in how we look at it to recognize that the science keeps changing and the advances keep moving on, and therefore the way in which you measure things also needs to be adaptive and flexible.
I want to thank you all for the comments. We are running a few minutes late, and if the panel would indulge me maybe a few minutes more, and if you all want to stay for questions and comments from each of you. So we do have some microphones here in the audience, and as we did before, if we could get those to the people who have the questions, we'll go ahead and start. So, did you have, right here? Okay.
Hi, I was wondering what the foreign biopharma investment picture looks like.
Foreign biopharma investment picture, if you did the same metrics for other countries. Do we have good metrics on global investment?
Just recalling some of the comments made on the first panel this morning, it is true that a number of other countries are making at a governmental and national level some significant investments. There's the European Innovative Medicines Initiative, where they're putting $2 billion into trying to drive this through a public-private partnership. And there's China has indicated that it's putting many billions of dollars into trying to make biotech one of the major pillars of its next 5-year plan. That being said, I do tend to agree with Kevin Scherer that no one is anywhere close to the U.S. in terms of the state of its innovation enterprise. So when I say that the U.S. enterprise is in crisis, I don't think it's in crisis because somebody else is about to eat our lunch. I think it's in crisis because it's not that investors are taking their dollars to go invest in European or Chinese biotech companies. It's because investors are taking their dollars to go invest in something other than biomedical innovation. And I know that talking about jobs going overseas is good political red meat. But the reality here is the jobs may be going overseas, but they're not going overseas to biopharma, I don't think. It's the problem here is that nobody has cracked the nut of how to turn science into therapeutic innovations in a more cost-efficient way. Everybody is struggling with the same problem, and we have to lead the world in solving it.
Murray, you all are doing a lot of global tracking. Comments to add to this?
Well, I would go back to when we looked at the 34 patents issued on those drugs launched last year. 21 of them were patented outside of the U.S. or by a company outside of the U.S. So we're already there in a sense, and I think we definitely see incremental activity going on outside of the U.S., whether it be in terms of discovery, research, investment, or in clinical trial sites, and which has an employment consequence as well. But let's also remember how long it is going to take for China and India to develop their full potential. So, we're still at the very early stages of what is going to be a 50-year track, I think, before they really become much more significant.
So I had a question up here, and then a couple more. So up here for.
Hi.
Okay. Jill, go ahead.
Hi. Jill Wexler with Pharmaceutical Executive Magazine. Jonathan, you had some data about the reduction in number of clinical trials that are being started, and I'm just wondering if you can take a glass half full approach and see that as researchers and sponsors becoming more selective and more efficient in deciding which clinical trials to start, and that maybe that's a sign of the industry taking all of your advice and becoming more efficient.
It's certainly possible. I mean, that's a hope, a glass half full. But in order for that to be true, one would have to believe that the industry as a whole is fundamentally better than it has been historically at predicting which drugs are going to work. And I don't know that we've suddenly gone through an inflection point. I just think that the industry is facing enormous pressures on the willingness of investors to fund clinical trials, and so they're having to reduce the number that they're doing. And so my fear is that we're going to see the same probability of success, but just on a smaller denominator, which will result in fewer things coming through the other end. This is one of those. I mean, you can always try and put an optimistic face on a very pessimistic scenario, and some people say, well, isn't it good if there are fewer venture capitalists, because then the ones that are left will have better projects to invest in. But that doesn't give me a warm and fuzzy feeling for the number of drugs that are going to be coming to patients.
Okay, Sean over here, and then there were a couple up front.
Yeah, thank you. I was intrigued by Murray's comments about metrics on the back end of this, and really from the payer perspective, and the new hurdles that we see, whether that's HTA overseas, PCORI here in the United States, IPAB, we know how Kevin Schiff felt about IPAB, and whether or not there's a concerted attempt by academics like yourselves and business people to measure, say, formulary placement, what the uptake is, not just the patents issued and products approved, but are the payers taking these and putting them on formularies? And then, as we know, formularies are stacked. What's the expense to the end user, the patient? How is that changing? Ultimately, how does that affect investors' opinions of whether, even if you make it through the regulatory cycle, do you make it through the payer?
So yes, I mean, I think ultimately the ROI does depend on what comes out the other end in terms of reimbursed payment for drugs. We do follow that quite closely globally, so we can see what's happening in terms of the uptake of new drugs. And actually there in the US, we're seeing since the last 2 years, we've had increases in the amount being spent on drugs in the market less than 2 years, which is our sort of measure of spending on new drugs. Most of that increase is driven by the new molecular entities that have been launched. Is it as high as the companies would like? Of course not. It never will be. But it actually makes us cautiously optimistic, actually, about the quality of what's been coming out in the last couple of years. The other issue is the U.S. is not the only drug market. There is $1 trillion spent on drugs globally, of which about $300 billion is the U.S. Japan is the second largest market, and there's a country that's really gone through a significant change on the regulatory side, which shows up as being an acceleration of approval of new molecular entities that have been launched somewhere else in the world that then come to Japan. That sort of change can also have a significant impact ultimately in the return to the investment in R&D. So yes, I mean these issues are important to look at and globally.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. There are a few good databases like Fingertip Formulary and Hippocrates, which you can track the tiers of new drugs, and we've looked at those. And I think over a long term, it's actually managed care has driving this companies towards a higher quality, more innovative drugs, because once you get 3 or 4 drugs in a class, then there's lots of rebates, lots of formulary placement. But for the new drugs with new mechanisms of action, they're typically tier 1 on the formulary, and so I think that's a big driver in what's going on in the quality area.
And to you, so you talked about the trend in venture investment, and obviously, how costly it is to get a product to market. How much could those trends also be driven by not just having to bring a costly product to market, but also one that really meets an unmet need and establishes a lot of additional value?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. The minute that investors get through lamenting the way that the time and cost is draining the returns out of drug development, they'll immediately turn to the reimbursement environment and how challenging that's become. And there is a perception that that's getting worse over time. And of course, you heard Kevin Scherer talk about the cloud that the IPAB puts over the environment for some people. And clearly that is already happening in Europe to a considerable extent, where there's a lot of direct government intervention in the pricing of new therapies. I mean, but here's what I think about it. I really do tend to agree with Henry that managed care, by and large, has been good for innovation in the sense that it has driven investors in biotech and pharma companies to invest in things that make a real therapeutic difference for patients, as opposed to just being the next drug in a class when the last drug is going generic. So I'll be the only one being promoted, but not really be any different. And that was the model for a while in the 80s and 90s. That doesn't work anymore, and nobody wants to invest in those business models. So in that sense, it's had a positive effect on where the dollars are going. As a policy matter, here's what I think I would say to policymakers. Here's what we need to be looking at in reimbursement. There's no question that we are going to be in a world where we're going to be scrutinizing the cost of medical interventions very carefully and paying for the ones that provide real value to patients and to the system. Just need to, and that's a good thing, but we just need to be very careful that we structure that system in a way that the real innovations that really do provide value to patients get paid for. So I'm all in favor of squeezing down what we pay for things that aren't providing value, but let's make sure that we are paying for the things that are providing value, do really make a difference for patients, and signaling to all of us, to the whole community, that the system is going to pay for those things and is welcoming those things, so that when we're making investment decisions today about new therapies that may be on the market in 15 years, we have confidence that they're going to be paid for if they make a real difference for patients. And that's when you talk about the IPAB, I have no problem with mechanisms like the IPAB, as long as we can be confident that they're constructed in such a way that they take into account innovative products that bring value to patients and pay for them, and focus their energies on squeezing down the cost of interventions that aren't providing value.
We have time for one more question over here.
Hi, Tibco Strategic Health Resources. My question is sort of on new sources of capital, because you mentioned VC and the university endowments and pension funds, but there are sources of capital, whether it's pooled angel investors, sovereign wealth funds. I mean, there are a number of new capital players that are interested in funding this type of enterprise. If you want to sort of comment on where the sort of the new sources of capital that could work along with VCs and private equity.
I can speak to that a little bit from the small device side of things. We've been experiencing, obviously the squeeze on the traditional venture capital investment, and considering pretty much all sources, we have actually done a little bit of work off of corporate grants from some of the large strategics. We have gone out and done some angel round financing. I mentioned in my opening comments that we're now experimenting with foreign government relationships. And, I was recently at a medical device conference with a lot of my serial entrepreneur friends who are out there trying to start new things up. And I think the maxim is any dollar's a good dollar. You used to talk about smart money and dumb money, but right now money is money. I think all of these alternate funding sources at the end of the day have severe limitations. And I think in each of the cases that we have seen people get off the ground with alternate financing scenarios, at least the ones that I'm aware of so far, come back to good old venture capital. And there's good reason for that. I mean, these projects take a good amount of money. And, there are angels out there that continue to run, that can write $40 million checks, but there's not many of them. So it's typically lots of small aliquots. And that's a big management issue for a team that's really out there trying to develop their technology, not trying to raise money 24/7. So I think that they're out there. I think that there's a role for them in helping to get very, very early stage things through a proof of principle. But at least I think for the near future, unless there's a significant evolution, I think that those are just going to end up coming back to traditional venture capital once the feasibility is a little bit more proven.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I'll just say that at the risk of sounding really cynical about this, if there's no return to the investment in the activity, then there's nobody who's going to invest in it unless they just don't get it, or unless they have some other objective other than earning a return. So if you can find somebody who's doing it for a charitable purpose, then fantastic, but I don't think you're going to find hundreds of billions of those dollars. To me, the emphasis should be on figuring out how we're going to construct the enterprise so that it provides a return that's appropriate to the investors, rather than thinking we're going to find some other investor who doesn't get it, that the return's not there.
Well, I think this last question highlights both the challenges in this area of improvements in the biomedical enterprise and the opportunities for doing so, both in terms of policies and in terms of ways for measuring the impacts of those policies, and maybe challenging us, one of those big, hairy, audacious goals. To make more progress. We are going to have more on this, so please stay in touch with us. What we're going to do further on this is going to depend a lot on the same way we got here, which starts with the staff at Brookings, who did a tremendous amount of work in putting together this big, complex topic. Greg Daniel, Sally Clucci, Aaron Carnes, Morgan Romine, Paul Tromke, who was challenged today with everything that people had to say, Beth Rafferty, Sarah Tetrault, Taylor Rinaldi, and Larry Kokot. Also the people who are on this panel and the previous panel. We do intend to do some more work with all of you on this topic, and especially all of you who participated today. Some great comments and questions from people who, looking around the audience, I know a lot and care deeply about making all this work. This stuff matters. Thank you all for being here with us today.